The wasteland stretched endlessly under a bruised purple sky, where 3 moons hung like watchful eyes. Nira knelt in the crystalline sand, her body trembling from exhaustion and the lingering pain in her chest, not from any physical wound, but from the hollow ache of abandonment. The transport that had brought her here was already a distant speck on the horizon, carrying away the only family she'd ever known. She pressed her palm against the ground, feeling the sharp edges of the mineral-rich sand bite into her skin. This was Korvath Prime's southern deadlands, a place where exiles were sent to face judgment from the elements themselves. Her father, High Magistrate Torvin of the Third House, had pronounced her sentence with the same cold precision he used to sign trade agreements. His eyes, so much like her own violet irises, had shown no flicker of doubt. "You are incomplete," he had said, standing before the assembled council. An empath who cannot control her gift is worse than one who possesses no gift at all. You leak emotions like a broken vessel leaks water. You contaminate the mental clarity of those around you. The law is clear. Nira had wanted to argue, to explain that she had tried, that the emotions flooding from others overwhelmed her defenses, that every joy and sorrow within 50 paces crashed into her mind like waves against fragile glass. But Torvin had not wanted explanations. He wanted a perfect daughter, one who could shield her thoughts with the effortless grace expected of their bloodline. She was not that daughter the wind picked up, carrying with it the metallic scent of an approaching storm. Nira forced herself to stand, though her legs shook beneath her thin exile garments. The council had provided her with nothing, no supplies, no shelter, no tools. That was the point. Either the land would provide, or it would claim her. Both outcomes absolved her family of shame. She began walking, though she had no destination. Walking felt better than kneeling in surrender. The crystalline sand crunched beneath her bare feet, each step leaving shallow impressions that the wind immediately began erasing. Within minutes, it would be as if she had never passed through at all. Hours dissolved into one another. The 3 moons traced their arcs across the darkening sky. Nira's throat became parched, her lips cracking. She had read about the Deadlands in her youth, during lessons about Korvath's geography. There were water deposits beneath the surface, if one knew where to dig. There were edible lichens that grew on the underside of rocks. There were caves that offered shelter from the cold. Nights, but reading about survival and living, it were vastly different experiences, as the primary moon reached its zenith. Nira's empathic sense, so cursed by her people, suddenly flared. She stumbled, catching herself on a jutting crystal formation. Emotions washed over her, foreign and strange. Curiosity, caution, concern. These weren't the rigid, controlled feelings of her people. These were warmer, more fluid, tinged with something she couldn't identify. A light appeared in the distance, moving slowly across the wasteland. Not the harsh beams of a patrol transport, but something softer, more yellow in tone. Nira's heart hammered. Was this a rescue? Had someone come to tell her the exile was a mistake? No. Even through her exhaustion, she knew better than to hope for that. The light grew closer, resolving into a battered vehicle of unfamiliar design. It was smaller than the transports she knew, more rounded, with strange symbols painted along its hull. The vehicle slowed, then stopped about 30 paces from where she stood frozen. A door hissed open, and a figure emerged, not Korvathi. The realization struck her like a physical blow. The being stood taller than her people, with broader shoulders and a different proportion to its limbs. Its skin was a warm brown tone, rather than the silvery blue of her species. As it moved closer, she could see its face so strange, with only 2 eyes instead of the 3 her people possessed, and a flatter profile to its features. Human. The word surfaced from her educational downloads. She had never seen one in person. Humans were traders, explorers, sometimes troublemakers. They were not supposed to be in the DEADLANDS dot. The human stopped several paces away, its hands visible and empty. It spoke, and though the words were incomprehensible, the tone carried through clearly, questioning, gentle. Its emotional signature washed over her empathic sense like warm rain, genuine. Concern mixed with surprise and something softer she couldn't. Name.NIRA tried to respond, but her voice cracked. The human moved slowly, reaching into its garment and withdrawing a container. It demonstrated drinking from it, then carefully set it on the ground between them. Before stepping back, water. IRA single quotes, S pride warred with her desperation, for only a moment before desperation won. She stumbled forward, grabbed the container, and drank deeply. The liquid was cool, pure, nothing like the recycled water from the city. She drank until the container was empty, then looked up at the human with wide eyes. It was smiling, a human expression she recognized from her studies. But the emotion behind it was what truly struck her. The human felt satisfied, happy even, not because it had power over her, but because it had helped her. When was the last time anyone had felt that way about her? Thank you, she whispered in her own language, knowing the human wouldn't understand the words, but hoping it would understand the intention. The human's smile widened. It gestured toward the vehicle, then at her, then at the vehicle again. An invitation. Nira's training screamed warnings. Accepting help from strangers, especially alien ones, violated numerous social protocols. But her training had also convinced everyone that she was defective, that she deserved exile and death. Perhaps it was time to stop listening to her training. She took a step toward the vehicle. The human's emotions sparkled with something bright and encouraging. It walked alongside her, maintaining a respectful distance. Its presence somehow both protective and unassuming. As Nira reached the vehicle's door and looked inside at the strange interior filled with incomprehensible technology and warm lighting, she realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she was making a choice that was entirely her own, not dictated by her father, not prescribed by tradition, not forced by circumstance. She climbed inside. The human followed, settling into what appeared to be a pilot's seat. It looked at her, pointed to itself, and said clearly, Marcus. A name. It was offering its name. Nira touched her chest. Nira. Marcus repeated it carefully, then nodded with satisfaction. He began operating the vehicle's controls, and soon they were moving across the crystalline wasteland, leaving behind the place where she was meant to die. As the three moons continued their celestial dance above, Nira allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in months' hope. The rover hummed quietly as it carved through the crystalline dunes, its headlights casting long shadows across the alien landscape. Nira sat rigid in the passenger seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the worn cushion as she tried to process everything happening around her. The vehicle's interior was cluttered with equipment she didn't recognize, scanning devices, bundled cables, containers marked with human script, and what appeared to be geological samples sealed in transparent cases. Marcus kept his attention on the terrain ahead, but she could feel his emotions shifting like colored smoke. Concern, curiosity, and beneath it all, a steady warmth that felt almost protective. It was so different from the carefully controlled emotional landscapes of her people, where any feeling deemed excessive was locked away behind mental shields. His openness was both frightening and strangely comforting. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Marcus spoke again, gesturing at various parts of the rover. He seemed to be naming things, though the words meant nothing to her. When he pointed at a glowing screen displaying topographical data that mimicked drinking water, she understood. He was showing her his supplies, his resources, telling her without words that she would be safe. Nira's throat tightened. When had anyone last wanted her to feel safe? The rover climbed a steep crystalline ridge, and as they crested the top, Neera gasped. Below them, tucked into a natural basin formed by ancient geological shifts, stood a small habitat structure. It was clearly human in design, angular, where Korvathi architecture favored curves, with panels that looked patched and repaired multiple times. But it had lights glowing in the windows, and from the equipment scattered around it, Marcus had been living here for some time. He guided the rover down the slope and parked beside the habitat. When he opened his door, a rush of cool night air flooded in, carrying scents utterly foreign to Neera, something organic and growing, mixed with machine oil and ozone. Marcus gestured for her to follow, and she did, her legs unsteady as her feet touched solid ground. The habitat door recognized Marcus with a soft chime. Inside, the space was compact but organized. One area held sleeping quarters, another contained research equipment and mineral samples, and a third surprisingly held what appeared to be a small garden under artificial lights. Growing things. In the DEADLAN, DS. Marcus moved to a small food preparation area and began heating something in a container. The smell that emerged was strange, but not unpleasant. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 cups and offered her one. Neera accepted it carefully, letting the warmth seep into her cold, stiffened fingers. She sipped cautiously. The flavor was complex, slightly bitter, with earthy undertones. Nothing like Korvathi beverages, but her body welcomed the heat. Marcus settled into a chair across from her, cradling his own cup. He watched her with those strange dual eyes, and she felt his emotions clearly, patience mixed with gentle concern. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't demanding explanations or payment for his kindness. He was simply present. Why? The word escaped her lips in her own language, barely a whisper. Marcus tilted his head, questioning. Neera struggled to find a way to communicate. She pointed at herself, then made a gesture pushing away exiled. Then pointed at him and spread her hands in confusion. Why help? Understanding flickered across his face. He set down his cup and thought for a moment. Then he pulled out a small device, a tablet of some kind, and began working with it. After several minutes, he turned it toward her. On the screen was a translation program, crude but functional. He typed something, and stilted Korvathi text appeared. No one should die alone in desert. The simple statement struck her like a physical blow. Neera felt her emotional shields, already weakened by exhaustion and stress, begin to crumble. Tears welled in her eyes, shameful, childish tears that no proper Korvathi adult would shed. But she couldn't stop them. Marcus's alarm spiked in her empathic sense. He set down the tablet and moved closer, his hands hovering uncertainly as if he wanted to comfort her, but wasn't sure how. His distress at her pain only made her cry harder. Through her sobs, Neera felt something else, a presence at the edge of her awareness, familiar and beloved. Her sister, Kelthi, 300 kilometers away, in the crystal towers of the capital city. Kelthi stood on her balcony, overlooking the illuminated streets below. She was younger than Neera by 2 cycles, with the same violet eyes, but stronger shields, stronger control. She was everything their father had wanted Neera to be. Kelthi's hands gripped the balcony railing, her carefully maintained composure fracturing in the privacy of night. She had stood in the council chamber when sentence was passed, had watched as guards escorted her sister to the transport, had met Neera's pleading gaze with the blank expression their training demanded. But now, alone, she let herself feel the grief she had suppressed. Neera was not defective. Neera was simply more open, more vulnerable to the emotional tides that flowed through all living things. In another family, perhaps, that might have been nurtured rather than condemned. Kelthi closed her eyes, extending her empathic sense as far as she dared. It was forbidden to search for exiles, acknowledging their continued existence. was seen as challenging the council's judgment. But she had to know, had to feel whether her sister still lived. For a moment, there was nothing but the emotional static of the city around her. Then, at the very edge of her range, a familiar signature flickered. Alive. Nira was still alive. And stranger still, her emotions weren't what Kelthia expected. Not the despair and terror of someone dying in the Deadlands. Instead, there was confusion. Grief, yes, but also hope. And beneath it, another presence entirely warm, steady, utterly foreign. Kelthia's eyes snapped open. What had her sister found out there? Back in the habitat, Marcus had given up on maintaining distance and simply sat beside Nira, his presence a solid anchor in her emotional storm. He didn't touch her, seemed to understand instinctively that she needed space, but his nurse helped. Gradually, her tears subsided. She used the translation tablet with shaking hands. My father cast me away. Sighed I was broken. Marcus read the words, and his jaw tightened. He typed back, You are not broken. You are different. Different is not wrong. Such simple words. Words that should have meant nothing from an alien stranger who knew nothing of her culture, her people, her failures. Yet they settled into her chest like warmth into cold stone. Over the following hours, using the clumsy translation program, they began to share their stories. Marcus explained that he was a geological surveyor, contracted to map mineral deposits in the Deadlands. He had been alone for 3 months, living in this habitat, and had another month before his contract ended. His loneliness bled through his words, even filtered through the translation. Nira told him about her gift, her inability to shield against the emotional bombardment of crowds, how every gathering became an overwhelming cacophony in her mind, how her father had spent years trying to train it out of her, and finally declared her irredeemable. Your ability sounds powerful, Marcus typed. Not weak, powerful. Nira stared at the words. No one had ever suggested her empathy was anything but a curse dot as the primary moon set beyond the horizon. Exhaustion finally claimed Nira completely. Marcus showed her to a sleeping alcove, providing clean blankets and a pillow. He communicated that she should rest, that they would figure things out in the morning. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Nira felt safe enough to truly sleep. Marcus returned to his work area, but couldn't focus on his mineral surveys. Instead, he found himself watching the sleeping alcove where Nira rested, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way. Her silvery blue skin seemed to shimmer faintly in the low light, and her 3 eyes, now closed in sleep, were arranged in a pattern that felt almost aesthetically perfect. But more than her appearance, something about her situation had awakened a fierce protectiveness in him. He had lost his own sister years ago to a preventable illness, had watched helplessly as she suffered because their family couldn't afford proper treatment. The memory of that helplessness had driven him to take dangerous, solitary contracts like this one anything to avoid feeling powerless again. Now, finding Nira abandoned in the wasteland, he felt that old determination resurface. This time he could help. This time he wouldn't fail. He pulled up his communication logs and composed a message to his employer, requesting permission to extend his contract. If he was going to keep Nira safe, he needed time to figure out a plan. The Deadlands might be harsh, but they were also remote. No one would look for her here, at least. That's what he hoped. Outside, the wind carried whispers of crystalline sand against the habitat walls. 3 moons danced their eternal pattern across the purple sky. And somewhere in the capital city, Kelthia made a decision that would change everything. She would find out what happened to her sister, even if it meant defying their father, even if it meant exile herself.